Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Friday, everybody. I hope you have had a productive week, and I wish you all a restful weekend ahead. Today, I am off-site for a series of meetings, and I'm filming this in a meeting room. The acoustics are not very good. My apologies in advance for the audio quality. Hopefully, it is not too distracting. Let's begin today's video with U.S.-China relations. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has completed his trip to Beijing, where he met with General Secretary Xi Jinping, China's top diplomat Wang Yi, and Central Military Commission Vice Chair General Zhang Youxia. According to a White House readout of the Sullivan-Xi meeting, the two sides discussed further implementation of the commitments President Biden and Xi Jinping made at the November 2023 Woodside Summit, including on counter-narcotics, military-to-military communications, and AI safety and risk. Incorrect U.S. perception of China is still one of the main complaints from Beijing, and Xi remains unwilling to admit publicly that the U.S. and China are rivals, telling Sullivan in the meeting, quote, "The number one issue is to develop the right strategic perception, and they need to first and foremost find a good answer to the overarching question, are China and the United States rivals or partners?" End quote. As we've discussed before, both sides know very well that the U.S. and China have moved to a place of strategic structural rivalry. The two also discussed cross-strait issues, Russia's war against Ukraine and the South China Sea. Quote, "Both sides welcomed ongoing efforts to maintain open lines of communication, including calling for a call between President Biden and President Xi in the coming weeks." End quote, according to the White House readout. Now, speaking of the South China Sea, during the talks, the Philippines resupplied the BRP Teresa Magbanua at Sabina Shoal, and unlike previous ship resupply missions, the PRC did not interfere. We will cover this in greater detail tomorrow. The upcoming US election was a factor in the background to the talks too. In response to a reporter's question on whether the Chinese brought up the issue of the election, Sullivan replied, quote, "I didn't really get a feeling for that. We didn't discuss the American election. That's obviously something for the American people to decide and not for any other country to get involved in." End quote. Despite this comment, however, as we have seen in recent weeks, many high-ranking Chinese officials and academics and commentators have been debating what the results of the US election will mean for US-China relations and Washington's China policy. Most agree that Washington's hawkish policies towards China are here to stay. And of course, Beijing's hawkishness with Xi Jinping still very much in power is likely to stay too. In the same press conference, Sullivan made other notable comments too. Quote, "The relationship remains a competitive relationship. We need to responsibly manage that competition, and we're doing that through this very detailed, painstaking multiple rounds of diplomatic effort. But we have to keep in mind too that there is always risks of escalation, risks of misunderstanding, risks of something going awry. And we've seen that before in the US-China relationship, and we've discussed those risks too, at some length, whether it's to do with cross-strait relations or the South China Sea, or European security and the war in Ukraine, or many other issues, including issues that were not previously foreseen, like incidents from a year or two ago." End quote. It doesn't seem like much progress was made in the talks, with mutual mistrust at all-time highs. But at least the two sides are talking, which is already a better situation than a year or so ago, when Beijing wouldn't accept any visits from US officials. An unnamed official speaking to UK-based Reuters explained that the US sees limited opportunity for talks with China on nuclear arms, expressing, quote, "We saw some limited opportunity to open at least the beginnings of conversations on the subject in the last months, but it's been fits and starts, and I think it will continue to be fits and starts. They have signaled some willingness to start nibbling around the margins of arms control, but then they're not very forward-leaning about following through on that." End quote. At a press conference on Thursday, the same day, a spokesperson for the Ministry of Commerce, China's Ministry of Commerce, announced that China and the US have agreed to hold a vice-ministerial meeting of the China-US Commercial and Trade Working Group in Tianjin on the 7th of September. Next week. On this topic of talks between the two sides, we note an article published yesterday by UK-based The Financial Times called "Chinese Officials Struggle to Build Ties with Donald Trump's Campaign. The outlet writes that Beijing's attempt to build ties with Trump's team have included deploying Cui Tiankai, ambassador to Washington during the Trump administration. Quote, but the outreach efforts have been largely unsuccessful, according to 8 US and Chinese people familiar with the situation. Chinese officials and visiting scholars, some of whom are seen as proxies for Beijing, have already been struggling to meet US lawmakers, but are now facing similar barriers with Trump's team. End quote. Next up for US-China relations, we move to the technology competition between China and the US-led West. US-based Bloomberg reports that Dutch company ASML may have been pressured to stop servicing some existing chip-making equipment it has sold to the PRC. Washington has been pushing hard for Dutch and Japanese chip makers to maintain a united front in its efforts to stop China obtaining the most advanced semiconductors. Bloomberg writes that the Netherlands plans to limit ASML Holdings' infeasibility to repair and maintain its semiconductor equipment in China, quote, a potentially painful blow to Beijing's efforts to develop a world-class chip industry. End quote. The Dutch government will likely not renew certain ASML licenses to service and provide spare parts in China when they expire at the end of this year, according to people familiar with the matter. The decision is expected to cover the company's top-of-the-line deep ultraviolet lithography, or DUM machines. Quote, the Dutch government's decision comes after some pressure from the US. A senior Biden administration official said the US government had raised the possibility of imposing certain unilateral measures on partner countries, including what's known as the Foreign Direct Product Rule, if these allies don't agree to align their China controls with the US. End quote. Interestingly, Sullivan, sitting on the Boeing 737 on the way to Beijing earlier this week for the talks we just covered, expressed to reporters at the time that the US was succeeding in its efforts to curb China chip ambitions, despite the fanfare around Huawei's newest phones and AI chips. Unnamed US officials speaking to US-based The Wall Street Journal expressed that, quote, any Chinese moves would amount to little more than a propaganda exercise, end quote. They described the technical aspects of Huawei's phone as mediocre and said that US efforts to maintain a technological edge on China are working, quote, no matter what Beijing says, end quote. Sullivan, speaking to reporters on the flight, expressed, quote, stockpiling is a challenge, but there's a clock on it. And not only because of servicing and components, but because of degradation of the capacity of return. So it is absolutely not too late for us to up our game collectively on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and that's what we're driving to do. End quote. Next up, yesterday, Thursday, 2 top editors of a pro-democracy Hong Kong news outlet, Stand News, were found guilty on sedition charges, the first convictions under the colonial-era law against the media in decades, part of Hong Kong's Beijing-backed authorities' legal campaign to crack down on dissent. The editors were prosecuted for articles published during the protests of 2019. The judge found that during the protests, Stand News, quote, became a tool to smear and vilify, end quote, China's government, adding, quote, the court rules that the political atmosphere was extremely heated at the time of the case. Many residents were dissatisfied or even opposing the Hong Kong and central governments. Under such context, the court found 11 out of the 17 articles to be seditious, end quote. The prosecution presented 17 articles published by Stand News as evidence of sedition, arguing that the outlet had sought to incite hatred against authorities through them. Those ruled seditious involved an interview with former Stand News journalist turned activist Gwyneth Ho, who was in May convicted of conspiring to commit subversion over her role in an unofficial primary election, along with 44 other pro-democracy figures, and opinion pieces written by South-exiled activist Nathan Law and journalism teacher Alan Au. Stephen Lee, the chief superintendent of the National Security Department of the Police, addressed reporters outside the district court on Thursday after the verdict was delivered. He said that when police arrested the outlet's editors in December of 2021, some people said the move was an attack on freedom of speech and the press. Quote, but today the judge's verdict clearly illustrated the necessity and lawfulness of the enforcement action taken on that day. End quote. The convictions carry a potential sentence of up to 2 years in prison. As you can imagine, the story hits quite home for me, and once again reminds one of the risks of doing this work while I live here. But I believe this work is important, and I will remain committed to producing China Update every day. If you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing are the only ways in which the algorithm will be happy and show this to new people and allow the channel to grow. We are a couple of hundred subscribers away from 75,000. It would be wonderful if we could reach that in the next week or so. And for those who would like to help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Next up, and finally for today, Chinese financial media outlet Sedition reports that a district government in Chongqing issued a notice about forming a so-called sell everything to save the day task force to raise cash by selling state-owned assets. The team was formed as massive debt piles at local government levels increase systemic risk in the world's second largest economy, offering a glimpse into how local authorities are struggling to tackle the issue amid pressure from the central government and top leadership. This is, of course, a theme we've been following for some time now. The notice went viral on the PRC internet. According to the document, the task force is led by the district's vice governor, with its office located in the district's financial bureau. A local official in Chongqing confirmed the matter with Caixin, expressing that the phrase selling everything to save the day is intended to convey a firm commitment to revitalizing and monetizing assets. Other Chinese regions have made similar commitments. Earlier this month, Jingxi City and Gansu urged local government-backed financing vehicles to step up asset disposals to pay off debt. In China, most of the non-financial assets are controlled by the local governments, which consist of some fixed assets such as public infrastructure and land resources. Local governments also have most of the public debt. By some estimates, including one recently from the IMF, local government debt is higher than 100% of GDP. Li Yang, a senior government advisor who also was head of the Beijing-based National Institute for Finance and Development, previously argued that while China's debt had risen rapidly compared to other countries, it has also created valuable assets to cover the debt. According to China's Balance Sheet 2020, a book he co-authored in 2021, Li expressed, quote, "The danger of debt depends on whether there are assets available to manage it in an emergency, and China certainly has these assets." End quote. One of the concerns from commentators, however, is that many of the assets that are owned by local governments were bad investments made in the last 10 years or so, meaning that they are not quite as valuable as local governments would hope. Veteran China analyst Bill Bishop expressed on the Caixin article, quote, "Many local governments are under pressure to find ways to monetize their assets, though I still do not understand who are the buyers, how they finance the purchases, and how they make the assets more productive to generate enough of a return to justify the purchase. It seems possible that there could be moving of assets from one government pocket to another using loans from state-owned banks." End quote. This is actually an area which Peking University professor of finance Michael Pettis, who we quote often, specializes in. He had much to say on the development. On the question of who would buy these assets, Pettis explained, quote, "As far as I know, there haven't been any attempts, or large-scale attempts anyway, to sell assets except land. And of course, since 2021, buyers for land have been scarce. There are, however, plenty of buyers for other assets, depending on the assets. It isn't hard, for example, to sell hotels, restaurants, shareholdings in private companies, convention centers, municipal facilities, liquor companies, apartment and office buildings, cement and steel factories, car companies, banks, fund managers, mines, and so on." End quote. However, like I said, it will depend on how valuable some of these assets are. In another piece published yesterday, Pettis made several noteworthy observations. Quote, "It is widely accepted now that to sustain growth and rein in debt, China must rebalance towards domestic consumption. But I've argued for years that the only way China can do so without a brutal slowdown in GDP growth requires that local governments give up assets. That's because the only sustainable way to increase the role of consumption in the economy requires that households retain a larger share of GDP, which in turn means that some other sectors remain a lower share. In the end, the least bad other sector is local governments. The most effective way to do this is for local governments directly or indirectly to transfer the assets they own either to banks to pay down debt or to households, perhaps in the form of higher services and lower fees. This won't be easy. It means undermining the power not just of local governments, but also of the local political, business and financial elites whose financial and political power was built around 3 to 4 decades of local government accumulation of massive amounts of assets. But the alternatives are also hard. The only other way to rebalance are either in the form of many decades of Japan-style low growth or in the form of contraction in GDP, with a smaller but still disruptive contraction in household income. This is just arithmetic. Of course, it's not at all clear that Beijing can pull off such a major institutional transformation in a way that is itself not disruptive politically. But in the past 2 to 3 years, China certainly seems to have been taking steps in that direction. And last week, a very influential Peking University economist told me that he and other policy advisors have been making similar arguments, pointing out that local governments have a lot of assets that they can sell or transfer. It will be hard, but at least it seems they may be trying. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Friday, have a restful weekend, and I will see you all tomorrow.